Imagine standing among 150,000 graves, all facing the same direction, all waiting for the same moment. For 3,000 years, Jewish families have chosen this hillside as their final resting place, believing their loved ones would be first in line for resurrection. But something's changed. The newest graves are creeping toward a gate that's been sealed shut since the Ottoman Empire, and biblical scholars are starting to whisper about prophecies that seemed impossible just decades ago. The Mount of Olives isn't just any cemetery. It's the most sacred burial ground in Judaism, where every tombstone points toward Jerusalem's Temple Mount like silent soldiers in formation. But here's what most people don't know. These graves are moving, not physically, but strategically. And each new burial pushes the boundary of the cemetery closer to something that has religious leaders around the world paying attention. The eastern gate of Jerusalem sits directly across from this ancient cemetery, sealed with massive stones for over 500 years. Muslim rulers blocked it permanently, knowing Jewish prophecy claimed their Messiah would enter through this exact gate. They thought they could stop prophecy with stones and mortar. But what if they actually helped fulfill it instead? Because right now, something is happening that no one saw coming. The story begins 2,500 years ago with a prophet named Zechariah who had a vision that seemed impossible. He wrote about a day when the Messiah's feet would stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain would split in two from east to west. But here's the detail that sends chills down your spine. He specifically mentioned the Messiah coming from the east toward Jerusalem. Fast forward to the 1st century, and Jesus of Nazareth stood on this exact mountain, teaching his disciples about the end times. When he finished his earthly ministry, he didn't ascend from the Temple Mount, or from Bethlehem where he was born. He chose the Mount of Olives, and the angels who appeared that day made a promise that still echoes through history. This same Jesus will come back in the same way you have seen him go, the same way, from the same place, toward the same gate. But there's something else happening here that most people miss. The prophet Ezekiel described the glory of God departing from Solomon's temple and resting on the Mount of Olives before the Babylonian destruction. And it was as if God was saying, "When I return, this is where you'll find me." Now, here's where it gets interesting. For centuries, Jewish tradition has taught that when the Messiah comes, the resurrection of the dead will begin right here on this mountain. That's why being buried on the Mount of Olives isn't just an honor. It's considered a strategic position for the afterlife. Every grave faces east toward the Temple Mount, but more importantly, toward that sealed eastern gate. It's like an army of the faithful, positioned and waiting. And that army is growing larger every single day. But what they're waiting for might be closer than anyone realizes, because the cemetery expansion isn't random. There's a pattern emerging that's making prophecy scholars take notice. Yet the eastern gate stands like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit the modern world. Built during the Byzantine period, it's the only gate in Jerusalem's old city walls that remains completely sealed. But this isn't just historical preservation, it's prophetic preservation. Ezekiel chapter 44 contains one of the most specific prophecies in the Bible. God told the prophet that this gate would remain shut until the Prince, the Messiah, would enter through it. No one else would pass through. The gate would wait, sealed and silent, for one person alone. When the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman rebuilt Jerusalem's walls in the 16th century, he could have opened this gate. Instead, he sealed it with massive stones and built it into the wall itself. Muslim historians say he knew the Jewish prophecies and wanted to prevent their fulfillment. But here's the twist. By sealing it, he may have actually confirmed it, because a sealed gate can only be opened by someone with the authority to break the seal. But there's another layer to this story that's even more intriguing. Ottoman records show they didn't just seal the gate. They encouraged Muslim burials directly in front of it. The reasoning was simple. If the Jewish Messiah was a priest, he couldn't pass through a graveyard without becoming ceremonially unclean. It was a theological chess move that seemed brilliant at the time. Block the prophecy with the dead. Except they missed something crucial. The Messiah they were trying to stop had already proven he had power over death itself. And now, 500 years later, something unprecedented is happening. The Jewish cemetery that was supposed to stay on the Mount of Olives is expanding. New sections are being developed closer and closer to the Eastern Gate. For the first time in history, Jewish graves are approaching the very gate where Muslim graves were placed to block Jewish prophecy. It's as if two armies of the dead are converging on the same point, and neither side planned it this way. Here's what's happening right now that has biblical scholars quietly taking notes. The Mount of Olives cemetery has run out of space. After 3,000 years of continuous burials, the traditional burial areas are completely full. So where are new graves being placed? Directly down the slope toward the Kidron Valley, toward the Eastern Gate. Cemetery officials call it a practical solution to a space problem. But when you understand the prophetic significance, it looks like something else entirely. Every new burial pushes the boundary of Jewish graves closer to the sealed gate, creating a site that would have been impossible to imagine even 50 years ago. The newest sections contain graves of Holocaust survivors, Israeli war veterans, and religious leaders who specifically requested to be buried as close as possible to where they believe the resurrection will begin. They're not just hoping for eternal life, they're positioning themselves for it. But here's what makes this expansion truly remarkable. The graves aren't just moving closer to the Eastern Gate. They're creating a direct line of sight between the Mount of Olives and the sealed entrance. For the first time in centuries, someone standing at the Eastern Gate can look directly up the slope and see an unbroken chain of Jewish graves stretching all the way to the summit. It's like a pathway of the faithful, pointing toward the very spot where prophecy says the Messiah will appear. And the timing couldn't be more significant. This expansion has accelerated dramatically since 1967, when Jerusalem was reunified under Israeli control. Before that, the cemetery was divided, neglected, and partially destroyed. Now it's growing faster than ever, as if making up for lost time. But there's something else happening that's even more intriguing. The families choosing these new burial spots aren't just random people, they're often the most religiously observant Jews, the ones who study prophecy and understand exactly what they're doing. As recent surveys show that over 80% of new burials in the expanded sections are specifically requested by families who mention being ready for the resurrection in their burial applications. They're not just buying graves. They're buying front-row seats to the most important event in human history. And they're not the only ones watching this development. Christian prophecy scholars around the world have quietly begun documenting every new burial on the Mount of Olives. They're not just casual observers. They're creating detailed maps, tracking the expansion patterns, and comparing them to biblical prophecies with an intensity that would surprise most people. Dr. Randall Price, a leading biblical archaeologist, recently stated that the cemetery expansion represents the most significant prophetic development in Jerusalem since 1967. But he's not alone in this assessment. Prophecy conferences across America now regularly feature sessions specifically about the Mount of Olives Cemetery, with some speakers calling it God's countdown timer. But the reactions aren't limited to Christians. Orthodox Jewish rabbis who rarely agree on anything have reached a surprising consensus. The cemetery expansion is divinely guided. Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, a prominent Kabbalist, recently wrote that the graves are positioning themselves for the Great Awakening, and that families choosing these burial spots are being spiritually drawn to the right locations. Even more intriguing are the reactions from Islamic leaders in Jerusalem. But instead of opposing the expansion, many have remained unusually silent. Some Islamic scholars privately admit they're watching the developments with great interest, though they won't elaborate on what that means. But perhaps the most telling reaction comes from the Israeli government itself. Despite strict regulations on cemetery expansions throughout Israel, the Mount of Olives has received approval for every expansion request since 1995. No bureaucratic delays, no environmental impact studies, no zoning disputes. It's as if even secular authorities sense something significant is happening. The Jerusalem municipality recently approved plans for 3 additional sections that will bring Jewish graves within 200 meters of the Eastern Gate, closer than they've ever been in recorded history. And then there are the tourists. Unchristian pilgrimage groups now specifically request visits to the new sections of the cemetery. Tour guides report that visitors often become emotional when they see the graves stretching toward the sealed gate, with many saying it makes prophecy feel real. But the most surprising observers might be the ones you'd least expect. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries have begun including the Mount of Olives Cemetery in their Middle East monitoring reports. Not because they expect political unrest, but because they recognize that religious developments in Jerusalem have a way of affecting global events in ways no one anticipates. When you piece together the prophetic timeline, the cemetery expansion creates a picture that's both fascinating and unsettling. According to biblical prophecy, and specific events must happen in a particular order before the Messiah's return. And the Mount of Olives plays a central role in almost every one of them. First, Jerusalem had to be back under Jewish control. That happened in 1967. Second, the Jewish people had to return to their ancient homeland in massive numbers. That's been happening since 1948, but accelerated dramatically in recent decades. Third, the focus of the world had to turn back to Jerusalem as the center of global conflict. Turn on any news channel. That's happening right now. But here's the detail most people miss. The prophecies also speak of the dead being prepared for resurrection. Not just spiritually prepared, but physically positioned. And that's exactly what's happening on the Mount of Olives. See, the Talmud teaches that when the Messiah comes, the resurrection will begin with those buried closest to Jerusalem, then spread outward. The new cemetery sections aren't just closer to Jerusalem, they're closer to the exact spot where prophecy says the Messiah will first set foot. But there's a timeline element that's even more specific. The prophet Daniel spoke of weeks and years leading up to the final events. Many biblical scholars believe we're now in what Daniel called the time of the end, not the end itself, but the period immediately before it. If that's true, then every new grave on the Mount of Olives isn't just a burial. It's a prophetic marker, counting down to something unprecedented. The mathematics are startling. At the current rate of expansion, Jewish graves will reach the base of the Eastern Gate within the next 15 to 20 years. That's not centuries or decades. That's within the lifetime of people watching this video right now. But here's what makes this timeline even more compelling. It aligns with other prophetic indicators that are happening simultaneously. Israel's technological advances, the global focus on Jerusalem, the increasing isolation of Israel among nations, and even natural phenomena in the region all seem to be accelerating at the same pace as the cemetery expansion. It's as if multiple prophetic clocks are all approaching midnight at the same time. And then there's the detail that gives even skeptics pause. The families choosing these new burial spots aren't just hoping for resurrection someday in the distant future. Many are elderly Holocaust survivors and Israeli war veterans who specifically state they believe they'll witness the resurrection in their lifetime. They're not planning for their great-grandchildren to see these events. They're planning to see them themselves. If these developments on the Mount of Olives are truly prophetic markers, then we're living in the most significant period in human history since the 1st century. But what does that actually mean for your daily life? How do you respond to the possibility that ancient prophecies are unfolding in real time? The first thing to understand is that prophecy isn't just about predicting the future, it's about preparing for it. The families burying their loved ones in the new sections of the Mount of Olives aren't just making funeral arrangements. They're making a statement of faith about what they believe is coming. But you don't have to be Jewish to understand the implications. Christian prophecy teaches that the events surrounding the Messiah's return will affect every person on earth. The question isn't whether you live in Jerusalem, it's whether you're spiritually prepared for what these developments might represent. Many people make the mistake of thinking prophecy is passive, something you just watch unfold. But biblical prophecy has always been a call to action. When Jesus taught about the end times on the Mount of Olives, he didn't tell his disciples to just wait and see what happened. He told them to watch, to be ready, and to live differently because of what was coming. The cemetery expansion offers a unique perspective on this preparation. Every family choosing to bury their loved ones closer to the eastern gate is making a decision based on hope, not fear. They believe resurrection is coming, and they want to be positioned for it. That same hope is available to anyone, regardless of where they're buried or where they live. The biblical promise of resurrection isn't limited to a specific cemetery or a particular location, but the Mount of Olives serves as a powerful reminder that these promises are real, physical, and connected to actual places and events. So, what should you do with this information? First, don't panic. Prophecy isn't meant to create fear. It's meant to create hope and urgency about the things that truly matter. If the cemetery expansion really is a prophetic sign, then it's a reminder that life is temporary and eternity is real. Second, pay attention to what's happening in Jerusalem. The city has always been the center of God's plan for humanity, and current events there often have implications far beyond the Middle East. The Mount of Olives Cemetery is just one piece of a much larger prophetic puzzle. But here's the most important response. Live as if these prophecies are true. Whether the Messiah returns in your lifetime or not, the principles of biblical prophecy remain the same. Love God, love others, and live with the understanding that this world is not your final destination. The graves on the Mount of Olives are moving closer to the eastern gate. But the real question isn't about their location, it's about whether you're ready for what might be coming through that gate. The Mount of Olives cemetery expansion isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a convergence of events that biblical scholars have been tracking for decades, but never expected to see accelerating this rapidly. Consider what's happening simultaneously. Israel is more isolated internationally than at any time since 1948, yet more technologically advanced than ever before. Jerusalem is at the center of global attention, with world leaders making decisions about the city that affect international relations. Ancient enemies are forming new alliances around Israel's borders, exactly as Ezekiel and Daniel predicted. And through it all, the graves keep moving closer to that sealed gate. But here's what makes this moment in history truly unprecedented. For the first time since the prophecies were written, all the pieces are in place. Jerusalem is under Jewish control, and the Jewish people have returned to their homeland. The world's attention is focused on this ancient city. And now, the dead are positioning themselves for resurrection in the exact location where prophecy says it will begin. The families making these burial decisions don't see themselves as fulfilling prophecy. They see themselves as preparing for it. But sometimes the most significant prophetic events happen through ordinary people making what seem like ordinary decisions. Every new grave dug on the Mount of Olives brings the cemetery boundary closer to the eastern gate. Every burial represents another family's faith that death is not the end. Every tombstone facing Jerusalem is a silent declaration that something greater is coming. The sealed eastern gate has waited for over 500 years. The Mount of Olives has served as a cemetery for over 3,000 years, but never before have these two prophetic landmarks been connected by an unbroken line of graves stretching from the mountain to the gate. It's as if the stage is being set for the most important event in human history, and the props are being moved into position by people who don't even realize they're part of the production. But there's one detail about this entire situation that we haven't discussed yet. Something that changes everything about how we should interpret these developments. Something that biblical scholars have only recently discovered in ancient texts that were hidden for centuries. And it has to do with what's buried beneath the Eastern Gate itself.